Hello. Thanks for joining for this very, very short webcast on how to pass P1. Now, this is, I guess, the sort of the gateway to the professional level. So, um, you may well be wondering what type of subject is it? And I think the first point to note really is that it'll probably be new to you, this area of sort of, corporate governance and assessing risk. You may have covered a little bit of ethics before, perhaps in your F8 paper, but essentially a lot of the areas that you'll be covering will be new. And it may well be that you don't deal with them within your day-to-day job as well. And that, in my experience of teaching P1, can be a little bit off-putting for students. So I've got a couple of ideas for you as to how you can deal with that. I'll talk about those in a moment. Um, so aside from new areas and perhaps a little bit of a lack of experience in the subject content, I think that one of the other things that I've heard students talk about is that they find the subject a little bit dry. And therefore studying for it is a little bit of a problem. Now, I mean, there are a number of subjects in the ACCA syllabus, and some of them perhaps are a little bit drier than others. I actually find P1 quite an interesting subject, but that's just me. I think the important thing to do when you start in your studies for P1 is just have a positive attitude towards it. I think there's nothing worse than studying for a subject that you've convinced yourself you don't like. It actually is quite an interesting subject, and it may well be that if you take that attitude, you'll find that it's a lot easier to study for. In other words, if you try and get involved in it as opposed to sort of stand off it. Okay, just try and find out about what it is. The other concern here, obviously, is that as you're coming into the professional level, you may be considering what are the subjects to take with P1, or perhaps you're sitting it on its own. I think that from my experience of teaching P1, students can pass P1 with a reasonable amount of work, and if you compare that to perhaps P2, maybe a lot more work is required, or indeed in P6 or P7. So, I think with the right attitude and the right amount of work, I think it's a very, very doable subject. So I'd be inclined to advise you to sort of attack the subject rather than think it's going to sort of be a bit dull or maybe a bit dry. There are some interesting areas within it, and perhaps some slightly drier areas. So, where did corporate governance, or where did this subject all begin? Well, just a funny little slide for you here of Robert Maxwell. And for me, the sort of the beginnings of corporate governance and perhaps the reason for it being was to some extent down to this guy who plundered 900 million from the Mirror Group pension fund back in, I think, or leading to 1991. And that scandal, and indeed several others, just resulted in the Cadbury report. 1992, and essentially what we're saying there is that what we were or what the government or legislators were looking to do was to really try and manage how individuals ran businesses, particularly when they were public companies. So essentially, what they've done is introduced, or what they did at that time is introduced a series of really guidelines, as it were, or principles, rather than sort of a legislation or rules, that sort of govern how businesses are run, how they're controlled, how they're managed. When you had people like Robert Maxwell, who committed suicide, when you have them running around sort of plundering pension funds, as you'd expect, it leads to all sorts of trouble. So really, in terms of the beginning of CG, we go back quite a few years, but since then, there's been just a large number of developments, not least in legislation all over the world. Certainly, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the United States, which, by the way, is rules-based, i.e., legislation. They have to comply with it, rather than what we have here in the UK, which is simply guidelines. Okay. Now, in terms of how you would deal, let's say, with a subject area like that, i.e., pure corporate governance, well, really, as I said earlier on, I think the key is to get involved in it and try and find out what it's about. You've got to dive into it. In terms of study technique for P1, I would say it's a little bit like a lot of subjects. The more you put in, the more you get out. The thing that I've noticed within P1 classes, not so much mine, but perhaps others when I hear the horror stories, is that what students avoid doing is questions and question practice. That's the key to passing really any exam, and it's certainly the key within P1 because, as you'd appreciate, we have a written paper here, and the syllabus is quite wide, and the examiner can really go where he wants with it. And there will be difficult questions on the paper, and you've got to put yourself in a position in your studies to be able to answer difficult questions. The only way that you're going to do that for P1 is literally to do exam questions under exam conditions. So, I would urge you to uh, keep an open mind in terms of the subject. Try and get involved with it. Sort of don't listen too much to the sort of the scaremongering about it being particularly dry. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I think just get stuck in. Um, what you're going to find is that to be able to pass the paper, you're going to need to demonstrate your professionalism. As I said at the start of this webcast, it's the gateway to the other P papers, as it were, and it is the professional level. So as I said earlier on about question practice, what you're going to be required to do is to report to another in a very professional manner. And what does that mean? What does professionalism mean? What does the professional level mean? Well, really, you need to be able to communicate information to individuals. You need to be able to lay out answers in a professional manner, or perhaps lay out a report or a letter. So all of these skills really don't have anything to do specifically with P1, but they're going to help you with other papers as well. So I think this is a good paper to to lead into some perhaps slightly more difficult papers. I think certainly keep a positive attitude, and if you put the study hours in, you'll sort of get out what you put in. Okay, so wherever you plan to study P1, good luck with your exams, and good luck on results day as well.